All right, Kraftwerk. Computerworld is the album that we're going to be covering last, right here. This one. Let's run the numbers, Matt, before I go ahead and introduce the tracks because I
Okay.
always forget, and then we'll go from there.
All right. So Computer World, it comes in at number 81 in the 1980s on Best Ever Albums. Number 2 in 1981. Number 536 of all time. It's Kraftwerk's third highest rated album, behind Die Mensch Machine or The Man Machine from 1978 and Europe Express from 1977. We did cover both of those records in previous episodes.
We
And
sure.
Computer World is not. None of these records we're covering tonight were on Rolling Stone's list. So shame on you, Rolling
That's
Stone.
surprising to me.
Yeah.
Okay, so in the montage, you would have heard Computer World 2, and now you're going to hear the track that follows it on the album, Computer Love. We talked about King Crimson Discipline and then taking a hiatus, and Kraftwerk also did the same thing, guys, because they released The Man Machine, which was recorded, as we all know, at the Kling Klang studio, one of my favorite studios of all of the time, right up there with the mobile studio and different stuff in terms of the Hall of Fame of recording studios. And then they began slowly working in that same studio on the album that would become Computer World in 1978. And by May 1981, they'd finally released the album. So they actually spent 3 years working on this album. In that time, they, if you remember in The Man Machine when we talked about it, they were influenced by all kinds of interesting sort of pop art type ideas, like the suprematism movement. And I think there's a pretty funny conversation we have about that, where it's sort of, it's like geometric art, painted in colors, and sort of they studied that. And there was a Russian artist and architect, L. Lizitsky, that they were in. So, as you've probably figured out, Kraftwerk has always been sort of enamored with the idea of technology and efficiency and sort of disembodied humanity and ideas like that, with like a we've talked about the motoric beat before, and sort of like a precision that's in there as well. And both of those movements talked about that. And during this time, Kraftwerk kind of just slowly worked on that album and continued to sort of view the world. A lot of Kraftwerk's sensibility is really looking almost like pop artists to some degree. They're looking at the world and trying to figure it out. And that way, I kind of almost feel like they have some of the sensibilities of like an Andy Warhol or something, when, whereas Andy Warhol was always trying to figure out the next, zeitgeist of cool kind of and pop culture. I feel like Kraftwerk is sort of more like, what's the next evolution of technology and progress, right? So a more scientific version of it. I could make a joke that I won't make about that being the difference between like American and German sensibilities, but it's there. I think it's also important to talk about that era, 1978 through 81. So I'll kind of pop quiz you guys. I mean, this is not going to be a shock to anybody based on the song titles and also the name of the album. But this is a theme about technology, but it's especially about certain types of technology. What, knowing the era that it's in and what we know about it, what particularly do you think was at the forefront of the guys in Kraftwerk's mind during this time? Because I think it's actually it's a very interesting side conversation we could have before we talk about this album. Any guesses?
You mean beyond computers?
Well,
Like how they're
it's
taking
specifically, but it's specifically about personal and home computers.
Okay.
I don't know if you guys, and that, I think that's important to mention, because like technology and computers before like the early 80s, which I think we forget, right, was not really a personal.
Yeah.
Like some
It was
people
more
had
academic and military usage.
Exactly. It was like you went to work at some places, especially if you were in what we would call a STEM career now, right? And you used a computer. And if you were one of the people that were into computers, you had to like build a computer, and like you had to be a real hobbyist, right? And now we live in the era where, I think all three of us largely grew up with a computer in our house for most of our life. You know, I'm sure we can all remember maybe not having it or having, you know, depending on the level of technology of our parents, right? It's kind of
Commodore 64, baby.
Yeah, but it's and I think, Josh, this might be up your lane a little bit, like in terms of where we're going here, but it's kind of, this is specifically about, well, what's it going to be like when everybody has a computer in their house? And this was actually somewhat of a, like, when they were doing this, it was sort of like, well, what is that going to be a thing where everybody's going to have a computer at one time
Well,
and
it seems
communicate via the computer?
It almost seems like it's kind of like almost similar to like when Radiohead did OK Computer. It was kind of like how it's isolating and how it's kind of like, you know,
but they were reacting to something that was immersed in popular culture. Like the idea of having computers in it. Like you're 100% right, Matt. Like, but they're coming at it once the computer had, you know, there's the internet, like that's a little bit more of what it's like. I think what's fascinating about this album is that the theme of this is personal computing and the idea of computer technology and the ability for that to possibly break down barriers on societal control and digital surveillance. That was the message on this. And when you think about the era we're in now, it's fascinating, right? That somebody was making an album in 1978 and 81 with all of these themes. Like, boy, we might lose, you know, there's going to be some issues with being able to keep tabs on people, but also the idea of, like, within that world, you know, they were so ahead of their time in some ways in terms of the theme that they were doing. I also think, and I don't know if you guys mentioned this, but the album was completely analog.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, did you guys catch that? Like, and no. I did after I listened to it, and it's there, but they specifically made the idea of this album as being an analog album, even though it's about computers, which I thought was a nice little sort of subversive, you know, artistic statement in many ways.
And you can tell if it's an analog versus digital recording.
I will be very honest. I didn't, right? I'm putting that out there because obviously my ears are not trained enough for that, right? But this was in the research I did. But I just thought it was fascinating that they did it because, I mean, you know, one of the things of analog is that it doesn't involve computer technology, right? That's a big piece of analog recording, which is funny because it's almost like a reaction to the theme of the album, right? Like,
how much was digital? Right? How much was digital recording actually happening in 1981? That was a relatively newer kind of thing, though, wasn't it? I think.
It was, but they were doing it. They were using it in previous albums
in the
because
70s?
You know, at the time it was the Vanguard, right? Like they were doing the recording, and it was a thing. But the fact, like, you had a choice to do it, right? And if you're a band like Kraftwerk that was in that world, right, like, you're particularly apt to do it. You also have to remember in the early 80s, the effect of Kraftwerk is all over popular music because, like, synth pop, like Gary Newman and, like, you know, right, the guy who did pop music and stuff, and just the whole wave of stuff that's coming. I mean, Kraftwerk's proteges, you know, are knocking down the charts at this point. You know, not to mention the fact that you had, you know, the Berlin Trilogy stuff and Eno and, you know, people being influenced by what Kraftwerk had done. So I just think it was interesting they took a step back a little bit and made this concept album. So I did want to bring that up because I think that's interesting context for this album instead of like a full bio. It did relatively well in the UK. It peaked at number 15, and it did become silver, which, you know, is relatively successful. As with most things with Kraftwerk in the United States, it did not have a large commercial appeal. It had a cult following, but it did not kind of cross over as well to the general public. But obviously, it was highly influential. I mean, my gosh, this album is much like all Kraftwerk stuff. It feels like is sampled all over the place. I think most prominently, you can't hear, you know, the easiest one is you can't hear Computer Love and not immediately place that song Talk by Coldplay, like immediately as the song. I mean, it was like instantaneous. It's like, oh, Jesus, like, look at this. So I did think that it was funny. I did read an article about that where Chris Martin sent a letter, a handwritten letter to Kraftwerk, I believe. I'm kind of paraphrasing this, so I apologize.
That's the only way you can reach them is by handwritten letter.
Well, right, and we remember we had that like sort of like the interesting things about communicating with them, which is also funny. They're making this music that's futuristic, but they're like very. I found that hilarious, but
Or
I
call them
think
when
this,
right when they're picking up the phone because it doesn't
exactly.
ring.
Yep. At exact times. Yep. So I thought it was very funny that the story I read said that he wrote a handwritten letter asking if he could use that sample for talk, and he received a letter in the mail later that was apparently just the word yes in lowercase letters was what the response was. So that's the story I read. If there's more context on that, I'd love to hear it because
pretty
they
funny.
cracked me up. But yeah, so but this album has been sampled all over the place. You may also know, and I didn't at first until I did the research, but then I went back. I'm like, the song "Fergalicious" by Fergie does borrow the opening synth line of "It's More Fun to Compute" as well, and there's a bunch of hip hop samples of this. LCD Sound System sampled this. There's a ton of people. We've mentioned African Bambaataa before because Trans Europe Express was used on there, but he also uses some of the lyrics from Numbers on this album as well for another track. So there's all kinds of stuff. Anyway, a little bit of a different type of bio right there because I wanted to just kind of use context right there because there's not a lot. I mean, they were recording this album and largely chilling out and observing the world, right? That's kind of what was happening here. But
Yeah.
I think the first person to talk on this one is Matt, right? That's your turn to start us.
I think so. Yeah. So I liked listening to this record. I heard a lot of these songs in the show that I saw a couple weeks ago.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
And it's interesting. It made me laugh because was it the first song? I think it's Computer World where they're just like business,
Yes,
people,
numbers,
numbers. They just and so I was laughing because first of all it's just funny because it's just like these singular words that are just repeating. But I also remember at the show that they had like they would as they were saying those words, the words would appear on the screen to really hit home.
Yeah.
What they were saying. So yeah, this and Pocket Calculator that made me laugh. Yeah, I liked it. Sonically, it doesn't stand out in one way or another from the other two records. Like they kind of are doing this really polished synth music. The production's great. Yeah, and I could not tell the difference between. The production sounds all the same. So the fact that they're doing this analog versus maybe if they did the other ones digitally, I'm not hearing too much of a difference there. But it's just. It's calming in some ways. It's hard not to laugh, or it's because it's kind of goofy as well. It's like I think I had it played in the kitchen, and Sherry's like, God, if an ATM machine could make music, it would sound like this. The bleeps and bloops and stuff. Oh, and then she also made it. She also said, "This kind of sounds like is this like where Sprockets comes from?" I was like, "Yeah, probably." And then she looked it up, and actually, the theme song from Sprockets is a song, a Kraftwerk song called "Electric Cafe" from 1986 that's sped up. So it's directly taken from that. So I thought that was kind of funny as well. But yeah, this is it's a really, in some ways it's simplistic because it's just here's the synth. I'm going to play these what seems to be kind of basic notes behind very basic beats, and it's just really interesting. I like synth pop or synth rock to begin with, and again, the influence is just it's very similar to the first two records in that this is where a lot of the synth pop comes from in the 80s that people really obviously the influence is there. The Computer Love song, it's interesting that it's not only sampled in that Coldplay song, it's very much the whole melody of the song, and it's not just the do 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 do. It's not just that part, it's the other parts too. It's that Coldplay really lays into it essentially. It's like they're totally ripping that song off, which it makes sense. That's a kind of a catchy melody that they're playing there. They do a similar thing in the last two tracks with Home Computer and It's More Fun to Compute. They kind of I remember them doing this with Trans Europe Express, the last couple of songs where they were different quote unquote songs because the tracks would start and they had different titles, but it was basically a different kind of take on the same melody that was already established before, so it kind of blends together. And so it's fine. I like it. I don't know which Kraftwerk album I would say that I like the most. I think that it's really hard because it all kind of just that this is like volume 1, volume 2, and volume 3 in a lot of ways for me. And I like it all. You know, it's very interesting. It's not. I don't think this is going to be one of my top albums for the the decade. You know, re-listenability, it's there. It's not huge. You know, this is not where I'm going to go to most of the time. But I can't. And it's the other thing too. I can't help listening to this without getting a smile. It just sounds so. It sounds dated, but but you also know that it's really, revolutionary in other ways. And it's just like boop 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 boop. Like it's just the computer noises that they're making. So I'm thumbs up on it. I like Kraftwerk. I like seeing them live, and it's they're an interesting band for sure. So thumbs up.
Yeah, I really like this album. I thought it's my favorite Kraftwerk album of the ones that we've listened to. And it's interesting that you said it was analog, John, because I feel like this is the kind of more complex than the previous albums. I feel like they're
all sneaky complex, but
Yeah.
I know what you're saying. Yeah.
And also,
When Matt said simple, I was like, I don't know if simple. It sounds simple, but there's a lot of shit going on, production trick wise.
yeah, they're incorporating a lot of, obviously electronic voices. They're the pocket calculator, pressing a special key, it makes a little melody, and then they play the little like ringtone thing, which I loved. And it sounds, maybe counterintuitively, it sounds kind of warmer as a whole, I think, than their previous albums.
I agree.
And, and I can't figure out what it is in the music that's doing that. The synth sound, maybe I think the production is really good on this, and I think in some respects the synth sounds more modern, and maybe that's why I'm thinking it's warmer as a result. But I really, talking about the King Crimson tracks that balance each other, Computer World and Computer World 2, they're kind of doing different things, and I think they're of a piece as well. The Computer World 2 is more instrumental, and I think it's supposed to kind of be a counterpoint to Computer World. And all of the tracks are pretty strong throughout. I didn't like Numbers that much, although that seems to be a popular song when I was looking at the stats, but that one I didn't really respond to. But I really like Computer World and Pocket Calculator and kind of the whole back half of the whole second half of the album. The Home Computer is interesting. It kind of has a darker synth sound. It's a little more menacing in some respect in my head, but it's still catchy. And I think at the end of the day, Kraftwerk makes catchy music, and I think you can't help but hear Pocket Calculator and have it get in your head and make you want to dance like a robot and laugh to, because I think they do have a sense of humor with what they're doing. I think they're, like John said, they are being intentional and definitely going for themes and exploring ideas, but I think they're also having fun with it, and I feel like that comes through in a lot of these tracks. I mean, and that's been the case since the beginning, right? Trans-Europe Express had that humor as well with that one song, the model.
Showroom Dummies.
Yeah, Showroom Dummies, exactly. Thank you. And so I think that's always been the case. But yeah, I hear what you're saying, Matt. I think they are simple in some respect, but they also kind of that's like the foundation for which everything has been built on for electronic music, I think. And yeah, this one spoke to me in a way that the other two didn't, and I was into it throughout. I just got into a groove listening to it, whereas the other ones, like I said, I think I responded to it more because it was warmer, versus the other ones felt like more industrial and removed and cold. This one maybe felt more contemporary or more 80s, quote unquote. So I liked it.
Yeah, I'm gonna. You're right, because I totally forgot that when I remember, especially Trans-Europe Express. I think I was using the term dystopian, and I think I might have used that a little bit with Dice Mensch Machine. This is not that. You're right. There is a lighter feeling to this, and I totally forgot that I used those terms to describe the other records. But yeah, this is a little bit more lighthearted than that. So yeah, I agree with that.
I feel like I hear completely different Kraftwerk albums than you guys do. Some like I love this album, and I'll be honest, I don't know if there is a band that has gained my esteem more in the time that we've listened to it than Kraftwerk. I just think they're endlessly fascinating. I think that they have their hand on the pulse to some degree of some music and societal trends that I have really grown to appreciate. Like I said in the bio, I think of them almost as like a combination of performance artists mixed with like commentators on technology and science. I hear why you guys are saying that it sounds warmer, but the second half of this album is like when the computers take over. Like, they're way more ominous than I think you guys are kind of giving them credit for. Like, the first little bit is almost like the idea of, like, when you're playing around with the computer, right? Like, oh, you know, it's a computer world, use it at job, use it in business and stuff. And then Pocket Calculator is like, look what it can do, you know, and then, like, Numbers is sort of like there. And then Computer World 2 is when, like, shit starts to get real, right? And it's like, I'm becoming dependent on these computers. And then it's like, I'm in love with this computer. And then I have a home computer.
Like
and then it's more fun to compute. Yeah. And like, it's like mood-wise, if you listen, it gets dark. Kind of like, and I mean, a lot of, like, I don't think Kraftwerk has like a truly dystopian viewpoint, but like, they're very aware of like, the duality of like modernism and technology. And I think a lot of what I find fascinating about them is a big piece of their music is about efficiency, but also they're almost making a comment on, like, can you create like an emotional response from this sort of computerized or digitized or metronomic type of music. And I think they're very, like, the word I would use on them is they are extremely subversive in terms of their music. And it's something that the more I listen to them, the more I pick up on. I also think it's fascinating. Like, I know that you said, like, I'm surprised Numbers is popular. I get it. I mean, Numbers sounds like any number of like 80s hip-hop songs. It basically sounds like an 80s hip-hop sample when you listen to it. And I know like Professor X, excuse me, not Professor X, the NWA's sort of like the guy that helped form it with Dr. Dre and Easy. I was reading that he's a big fan of this album. It doesn't surprise me because I think it's very interesting how Kraftwerk operates in a way that they could spill into hip-hop or electronic music or even rock music. I mean, shit, when, like, Chris Martin, early proto-hip-hop artists and, like, electronic music, you know, artists are all interested in what you're doing. You know, you're speaking to a pretty damn large audience right there. I also think it's interesting that Kraftwerk, to some degree, are sort of guys that would get stereotyped as being, you know, computer nerds or hobbyists or stuff, but they come across like that they're aware of that almost, you know, and like they lean into it a little bit, but in a way that they become cool because they're aware of the fact that they are obtuse, kind of, which is a little bit of what Sprockets was, Matt, when you think about it, right? Like, there's this guy who's completely convinced of, like, that he's cool, even though he's doing these things. When you look at it, it's like, it's just kind of like ridiculous, but there's an aesthetic to it. I really like this album. I liked a lot of the albums this week, so I don't know if I'd say it's my favorite or not, but it's one of my favorite albums we've covered in the 80s so far. And I just want to shout out the complexity and the trance-like quality that you can fall into here. It's always fun to me to listen to an album that doesn't have much in the way of lyrics to guide me, but I can still get a story from it anyway. And I know you guys said that, like, you smiled when you heard this album. I know what you're saying. Like, Pocket Calculator is a very fun song to listen to. But I don't know if I was processing them as like a haha or like a goofy sort of sound. Like there's always like an ominousness, like to what Kraftwerk's kind of telling you, like be appreciative of the technology and embrace it, but embrace it with limits. And like that seems to be sort of like the through line of all of their music, right? Like be both embrace and beware of modernity, but embrace and beware of computers or societal progress or different things like that. Convenience, right, was another one. Like and I don't know, like listening to Kraftwerk in 2022 when they're talking about like topics like our computers taking over people's lives, like is it good that we're communicating through these digital methods and like using it to filter our emotions and digital privacy? I'm like, Jesus, this album speaks even more in the modern era than it did back then to some degree. And the fact that they were like already like this could be problematic, and like I just try to think of like how they view the world now, because it's kind of like, oh shit, like all of our dystopian stuff happened, so like I can't help but think of like social media, right? It's like when you're primarily communicating with the world through like computerized things, it seems like that's kind of like the worst case scenario of what like and online dating, right? Computer that's like computer love. It just was kind of interesting to me. So
well, you bring up a lot of good points. This is a strong concept album if it follows the progression of what you said, which I can kind of see in the titles when you were describing the.
I mean, I never read that was what it was, but it just seems I'm very certain that that's what they were going for. To be quite honest, like it just feels that way to me, at least. Yeah.
Yeah, and this is and it makes sense. It's not something that I would have thought of, and it's not something like I don't listen. It's so interesting just like talking to you guys about this stuff, because it's when I listen to music, I'm not like trying to find out messages or trying to find patterns of like, ideas and stuff. Even with something that kind of like, and when you describe it like that, John, this kind of just smacks you in the face with that, after you're hearing that, It's like, oh, of course it means that, but it's just indicative of how I'm not thinking, my brain's not going there. I'm like, what is it doing to me musically? And yes, admittedly, like I'm missing out on stuff when I'm doing that, but it's just,
I'm not saying I'm right. This is how I'm hearing it. I didn't read that.
But you definitely. But you definitely seem to listen to music and try to draw messages out, or you try to draw what the theme is, or like all of that stuff. And I am not doing that at all. Like even albums that are like, you guys are like, oh yeah, that's easily, I can tell that that's a concept album. Sometimes I'm like, oh, I had no clue, right? Like, and I just, because I am just not thinking about that, and I know.
Well, to me, when you make an album, to some degree, it's always a concept to some degree, right? Because you're making an album. If you were not, you'd be releasing singles.
I guess the most I think about that is like how are the tracks ordered in terms of like, how they flow into one song into another, like how does that feel? But that's more of a sonic kind of a thing rather than like a message or storytelling kind of a thing. So that's kind of,
to me, it's easier with Kraftwerk, because Kraftwerk is a concept band. Yeah. So of course they're going to, like, to me, like, that's the first thing I should be listening. I do it to begin with. That's why I think when sometimes people are like, I can't pigeonhole your tendencies, John, as much musically as other. I'm like, that's because some of it is because what I listen to music for isn't necessarily genres or sounds, right? It's like, what is that when I'm doing albums, right? Like, is this album interesting to me? Is always at the forefront. And if it's not interesting to me, it can sound beautiful, and it will never rise to a certain level. Like I think that might be the stylistic difference between me and you, right? Like for you, Matt, there's a beauty aesthetic, right? Of the sonic, right? Like a certain sonic sound that hits you, right? Whereas for me, it doesn't have to be deeply complete, but there has to be something, right, that it speaks to. Yeah. Beyond just, oh, that's like 6 songs I like, but they're just kind of there, and in an album format at least.
Yeah, I can love a song that's absolutely nonsense. Mm-hmm.
I mean, I can too, but it would help if it's in a greater, artistic and
no, but it makes sense.
Josh, I feel like you're in the middle,
And I see what you're saying too here, because you're right. Those last couple of songs, it does get darker than the beginning. So yeah, yeah.
I mean, I felt like I just had to point that out because you guys were like, it's very light, right. And I hear what you're saying, but it's like I didn't. my vibe was that this was not a like light album. It was.
I guess I didn't
like,
get as much of a, because when Josh said that this, initially, my recollection was like, that's right. When I listened to Trans Europe Express, I was like, man, a lot of that just seemed dystopian to me, and I didn't get that feeling.
Well, it was,
so that's when I jumped on. I'm like, yeah, it's lighter because of that, but it does progress in a different way. I agree.
Well, even think about, and I just came up with this, so this could be, but Chris Martin sampled "Computer Love for Talk" by Coldplay, right? Which is about like him trying to talk out a relationship, right? That's kind of ending, right? If you know that song, it's like, can we talk? It's basically, the relationship's falling apart, right? They're not communicating and stuff. And like Computer Love kind of has that aesthetic, even if he's not doing it. And so it's just kind of, and Chris Martin would have released that, X and Y, I think that was on, right?
05, 04.
Mid-2000s, yeah, around there, when that was becoming a thing, right? Like communicating more electronically and feeling disconnected. And it just was, there's a lot of those. That's, I think, why I like so much, like, who was influenced by this or where did it come from, because you see these through lines. Like, Chris Martin takes that and kind of to some degree is able to connect that sample that he wants to this song about a relationship ending. Anyway, that's my take on it. I could be completely wrong, but
it could be. It's better than my theory, which is like it's just about computers, which is not very deep.
It is. But
yeah, I was hoping to talk a little bit more about. I'll be honest, I was hoping to do a little bit more about personal computing and talk about like just how revolutionary it was to have a computer in your house, and like how I don't know if me and all of us know, like I think like even as I talk about it, like I know it like in like, wow, yeah, you think about what it, but I don't know because it wasn't really a thing, right? And so maybe we can explore that another time.
I mean, we're all old enough that we didn't have computers in our house at one point, so I mean, I
don't remember really. I had a Commodore 64 early on.
Okay.
I mean, I can remember my dad like buying a Dell, right, at like the very early 90s, but it was sort of just this device that you typed on, right? Like it was there wasn't like an internet component to
I just played
it,
video games. We had all these floppy disks, and we had video games that we had to actually load the program. I remember that.
Right. Yeah.
It was very much like an ancillary thing. I just think it's very interesting that they were aware of the fact that, and you'll hear like, Steve Wozniak, I know, right, talked about that a lot, like that he saw the personal computer coming before anybody, and right, wasn't that kind of Apple's deal, right? That
that was their whole angle, was getting home computers in.
Right. So.
Yeah. Good. I think that's a good read, John. I like it. So.
There you go. Well.